Here at the Peepshow Podcast, we talk a lot about supporting sex workers. And one way you can support sex workers is by paying for your porn.
Why not take this opportunity to support queer porn made by queer porn stars? Queerporn.tv is offering $10 memberships all summer long. Being a Queerporn.tv VIP guest grants you access to all of their exclusive scenes featuring all kinds of queer hotties from around the world. We love it, and we know you will too. Welcome to the Peepshow Podcast.
News and stories from the sex industry.
With Jesse and PJ Sage. Welcome back to another episode of the Peepshow Podcast. This week we talk to Danielle Blunt, sex worker rights advocate and co-founder of Hacking Hustling, a collective that works at the intersection of technology and social justice. We discuss the EART IT Act and how important it is to protect online spaces for marginalized communities.
Hey, I'm Adrian, one of the hosts of After Adult Podcast. My porn name should be Mozart Fremont, but you probably know me better by my actual porn name, Siri.
I'm Rachel, but my porn name would be Woody 16th Avenue.
After Adult is a podcast about life and porn.
I don't actually watch porn.
I don't really watch that much porn either. I probably watch more than you, but I mean, most of the time it kind of would feel like going to work on my day off.
You 100% watch more than me, because I don't watch porn. Find us wherever you get your podcasts. Just search for After Adult.
Or visit afteradult.com and follow us on Instagram at afteradult.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Peepshow Podcast.
Welcome.
So today we are talking about the EART IT Act, which is pretty heavy stuff. But before we get into that, we just wanted to give you all a little bit of update.
I don't have an update. I'm just sitting here sweating.
Oh, yeah. Well, that is kind of an update. It is so hot in here, and we do not have central air, and we have this tiny little window air conditioner that is just like wheezing and not really doing anything.
And PJ is like so particular about the sound recording that we can't keep the air conditioner on while we record.
Yeah, you are such a martyr for the cause of this podcast, Jesse. Thank you for your sacrifices.
You're welcome. You're welcome, audience, for sitting here in my own sweat while we talk about the EART IT Act. No, seriously, it's so hot in Pittsburgh right now. And I don't think it was this hot last summer because we also did not have central air last summer. And I don't really remember it.
Or the summer before that.
Yeah.
Or the summer before that. It's just really annoyingly hot this year. Global warming or some such.
Yeah, but I mean, we did go outside, we went to the park and, so you can leave the house, but man, it's hot.
Okay, so enough about the weather.
Yeah, this must be now the most boring podcast ever.
The Peep Show Small Talk Cast.
Yeah, I mean, what else has happened this week besides, sitting in heat?
Just working on the site. The site is up and running, and we have been adding all sorts of things to it. We have an events page now with a roster of sex worker relevant events that we're going to continue to update from around the globe.
Yeah.
Especially these days in the age of the COVID pandemic. So many events are virtual that makes sense for us to try to keep a calendar of what's going on across the country and around the world, because you can tune into those events from the comfort of your own living room.
Yeah. My new series that I'm doing, When We're Not Hustling, came out last week with Melody Kuch talking about poker playing. And I have another one coming out this week, so that will be very fun as well. Yeah, and let's see, what else have we been up to besides just doing the website? I mean, that's the biggest thing.
Yeah, I don't know what you're talking about. I pretty much have been coding this website all day, every day since the last time we recorded a podcast. So.
PJ's just started talking in code. We don't even, have...
I like dream in code now. It's not even really code. It's just like CSS, but still.
Is that how you're dreaming?
I have definitely had website-related dreams in the last couple weeks.
Yeah, I mean, that's something. Yeah, so, honestly, that's all we've been doing. That's all we have to talk about is, like, just pouring our hearts and souls into this venture. So
so we won't bore you with that any longer. Just go to peepshowmedia.com.
Or, even better, patreon.com/Peepshow Podcast, because we do have to eat.
Yeah. Yeah. And we love you all. Please help us.
Please help us.
No, seriously.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's all the news that's going on in our corner of the world.
Yeah. And like I said, this is a really, really important topic. And I think we ought to just jump right into it.
Yeah. Sounds good. Let's get to it.
This episode of the Peepshow Podcast is sponsored by Quick and Dirty Media.
Are you an independent content creator, webcam model, or clip maker? Quick and Dirty Media can help you with your video editing and production needs at a reasonable price, allowing you to devote more time to creating your content. As a special offer for Peepshow Podcast listeners, the first 5 content creators who submit a video for editing will receive their first order free. Make sure to use the promo code PeepshowPod. Find Quick and Dirty Media on Twitter at QuickDirtyMedia or send an email to info@quickanddirtymedia.com. Quick and Dirty Media is proud to be an adult-friendly business. We're here today with Blunt from Hacking Hustling. How are you doing?
I'm doing.
Yeah.
That's what I'll share with you. Yeah.
Yeah, these are really stressful times.
Yeah, it's an incredibly stressful time, and I think that we're all just doing our best to take care of ourselves and each other. That's the most that I can do right now.
Yeah, I think that's all we can do right now, too. Tell us a little bit about who you are and the work that you do, especially the work that you do with Hacking Hustling right now.
Sure. My name is Danielle Blunt. Some of you might know me better as Mistress. I am a public health researcher, a sex worker rights activist, and an anti-human trafficking advocate. In 2018, I co-founded Hacking Hustling with Melissa Gehrig Grant in response to the removal of Backpage and then the subsequent signing of FASTA into law. So we were organizing together to create immediate harm reduction tools so that folks would feel empowered to stay safer in this increasingly dystopic, horrible surveillance state that we live in. And so Hacking Hustling is a collective of sex workers and accomplices working to interrupt state surveillance and violence that's facilitated by technology in all of these myriad of different ways. And we believe that sex work is work and that all work is vulnerable to exploitation under capitalism. So some of the things that we do is we put on harm reduction digital security trainings. We have a research team and research the ways that sex work is mediated by technology and sort of what happens when we lose access to those safer working tools, which I'm sure we'll get into more.
Yeah.
We really try to bring these conversations into institutions where sex worker voices have been historically ignored in favor for people with credentials that are instead telling our stories for us.
We should probably start off by recapping a little bit on FASTA, real quick.
It's funny, I was thinking that too.
Because
and how we met,
Yeah, I feel like, especially, I think most of our audience are probably living the consequences of FASTA every day. But for any listeners who aren't fully aware of what FASTA is, maybe we should step back and talk about that history. We started the podcast right as that all was happening and pretty much consumed us and became our focus for the first year because it was just such a
It's hard not
threat.
to. It's so ever present in our daily lives, working and organizing. Both
Right.
FASTA and now earn it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So how would you define FASTA SESTA?
Yeah. So FASTA SESTA was a package of bills that was signed into law in 2018. It amended Section 230 of the Communication Decency Act, which basically said that platforms aren't liable for the content that their users host. So this is like a really important piece of internet legislation that allowed for the free and open web to develop and flourish as we know it.
Yeah, a lot of people call it the First Amendment of the internet, right? Like that's the slogan.
Yeah, right. And so what FASTA SESTA did was create a carve out of Section 230 saying that you can have 230 protections unless it's aiding or promoting the facilitating of sex trafficking or sex work. So what FASTA SESTA did was create this environment where, on one hand, platforms were totally unsure of what could and couldn't be on their platform and created this environment of fear, which led to the shuttering of platforms before FASTA SESTA was even signed into law, not to mention all of the websites that we lost afterwards, because this carve out to Section 230, what it did was put the liability on platforms for potentially financially crippling litigatory actions being taken against them for aiding and promoting trafficking or sex work. And this bill is incredibly vague and broad. And so what we saw on like the work, so like that's sort of what happened on the platform side of FASTA SESTA was that websites just shuttered because they're like, we don't understand this. This law has never played out in the court of law. It's actually being used in a case against City X5 right now, which I think 2 weeks ago it was filed as the first case to be tried under FASTA. So that's still happening right now as we're recording this, and we still don't know what the legal impact is. But what we do know is that the platform response had devastating results to our community. Yeah. And we lost harm reduction working tools. We lost websites that we used to stay safe. People were reporting losing like personal email accounts and things like that. And what I think it also did was create this environment of fear and surveillance within community. And I think there's so many ways that we interact with technology that we don't really understand what's going on. We don't really, I'm speaking for myself right now. Where like, I don't really necessarily understand the like mechanics or the like legal side to these technologies that I use every day. Right. So when you have this bill that's threatening your livelihood, and when you're seeing all of these harm reduction working tools disappear, when you're seeing your community and yourself slipping into increased economic insecurity, right? What happens is that everything then becomes seen as a threat. Whether it is because of FASTA SESTA or whether it is because of this like overarching horophobic ecosystem online within which we like live, organize, meet people, and like try and keep each other safe.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that one of the things that you're saying is not only did it like actually create a lot of harm for our communities, but it also like elicited a kind of fear that put everybody into like a panic mode too.
Yeah. I remember when GDPR passed and everyone got like 45 emails of updates in terms of service, and a bunch of sex workers are finding horophobic clauses saying that like we're not welcome on the platform. Right. And those had been there for years. And I'm not saying that that's not like a very real fear, but I think there was this over attribution of this horophobic landscape that we work and live in that was then attributed to FASTA SESTA. So something that I like to say is that FASTA SESTA is just one thing. Right. And like what I think is also important to note is that the legislators who championed FASTA SESTA as a win said that it was responsible for taking down Backpage, which actually came down days before FASTA SESTA was signed into law. So like, first of all,
the chronology is
totally
backward.
a fucking lie. Yeah, like that's a lie.
Mm-hmm.
And like we've been losing access to these websites, Rent Boy, and my brain is blanking, but there's just tons of websites. As soon as we adopt to a website, like we have, and then we someday lose access to it, and we just like keep moving and keep surviving and keep sharing resources.
Right.
But this removal of harm reduction working resources or the platforms that we advertise on, losing them is not something that's new to this community. It's not something that's new because of FASTA SESTA.
Right.
FASTA SESTA just sort of exacerbated this issue, just like really fucked over like so many different communities.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is worth saying that FASTA SESTA went into place in 2018, in April of 2018, and it's more than 2 years later when the first
case is being brought to trial. But yeah, I mean, there is, and, you know, it's also just side note, it's the constitutionality of the law is being challenged in a different case right now as well.
By Woodhull, yeah.
Yeah.
I think the ramifications that it had on chilling speech, on like platforms' impetus to censor marginalized users. And when we think about like who are the folks who trade sex, like who are the folks who need access to these resources, these are the people who are being like policed most heavily on the street, who are being policed most heavily on the platforms that they use.
Right.
And when you lose access to any sort of resource that you use for your business, what it does is it pushes you into increased economic instability, which actually makes you more vulnerable to the circumstances for labor exploitation.
Right.
So what FASTA SESTA actually did, and Hacking Hustling has conducted research on this, is push people into more vulnerable working conditions that make them more vulnerable to trafficking.
I think an underlying point there is FASTA SESTA was sold as an anti-trafficking bill, but the language of FASTA SESTA applies not just to trafficking, but to, you know, prostitution. And so that's part of what is exacerbating these issues, or that's part of this economic peril that you're discussing.
I think it also like frames these two communities as two disparate communities when in fact anyone under capitalism is vulnerable to labor exploitation. And the majority of trafficking of labor doesn't happen in the sex trades. It happens in domestic and agricultural work. And both FASTA SESTA and EARN IT, which we'll talk about in a little bit, don't do anything to address actual harm or violence that people actually face.
Right.
All it does is make these resources less accessible.
FASTA SESTA kind of set the tone, and now we have EARN IT. So can you explain what EARN IT is and how it's different than FASTA SESTA?
Sure. So EARN IT stands for Eliminating Abusive and Rampant Neglect of Interactive Technologies Act of 2020. And honestly, I wish like Congress would put half as much effort into creating snazzy acronyms that they would into like actually directing resources to impacted communities. That would be great. But so we have like FASTA SESTA, which is framed under the guise of stopping human trafficking, and we have EARN IT, which is under the guise of limiting child sexual exploitative material.
Right.
And so these are two really serious issues that, like, as Hacking Hustling as a collective of like sex workers, survivors, and organizers and accomplices, like we take these issues very seriously.
Yeah.
And these bills do nothing to address this, but what they do is they stoke fear. I think we see this with like anti-terrorism law as well as anti-trafficking law, that this fear is used to pass bipartisan legislation that actually increases the surveillance of everyone and reduces these harm reduction working tools. And it uses language that makes policing and surveillance seem like the only option while completely ignoring that what we know to be true is that directing resources to impacted communities is something that concretely reduces harm.
Yeah, so surveillance, I mean, when you're talking about surveillance, you're talking about ending encryption, you're talking about other sorts of technology that's used to surveil, like facial recognition software, right?
Yeah, EARN IT is, I can talk a little bit more about EARN IT and then get into why we would be talking about encryption, if that works
that'd
for
be
you.
helpful,
Yeah. So EARN IT also amends Section 230 of the Communication Decency Act, but it does it in a slightly different way, which I feel is like more broad and vague. What EARN IT does is it proposes a commission of 19 different individuals, largely made up of law enforcement, headed by Attorney General Barr, who is very, very anti-encryption, and if you can find that anywhere online about how he wants to end encryption. So the bill doesn't actually mention encryption anywhere, and Barr loves to point to that. But like experts know and understand that the point of this commission is to end access to encrypted services. And this commission of 19 different people who we do not know would create a set of guidelines which we do not know and would not have a chance for public feedback on, as it's a fast track bill, so it's not taking the normal path that it does to being signed into law. And so right now, I think it was 2 days ago that the Senate Judiciary Committee unanimously moved EARN IT forward. So no one opposed it.
Right.
So it's just one step. FASTA was signed into law 97-2, and EARN IT so far is unanimously unopposed by the Senate Judiciary Committee. So it's this committee of 19 random people making up random rules that platforms would have to comply to literally earn Section 230 protections. And so we don't know what that would look like. There is no community feedback on it. There are no sex worker feedback on it. And I think when sex workers were like the community warning about the harms of FASTA and like expertly predicting what the immediate harm would be and like what would happen to platforms. So they know how this harms marginalized communities. They know how this harms the sex working communities. They know how this harms like survivors who trade sex. And that's not being brought into the conversation around Section 230 protections.
Yeah. So, I mean, the thing that always strikes me every time I hear somebody explain that is that also puts every platform that's not like the major platforms out of being able to buy their way into having Section 230.
Yeah. We're actually seeing a lot more pushback from tech on EARN IT. Not enough. But that FASTA is just like everyone was fucking quiet.
Yeah.
Like I remember speaking at the Lesbians Who Tech conference. And I think it was like 1% of all speakers ever mentioned FASTA. It was like, this is like a fucking queer tech conference. Like this is an internet destroying, like a globally internet destroying bill that has like global ramifications.
Yeah, we had the same experience at Theorizing the Web. We didn't think to make sure that people were talking about that because we just assumed that they all would because it was weighed so heavily on our minds. And then when it was just radio silence, it was shocking to us.
Yeah, you can dig into our archives like 2 years ago and hear us ranting in the car on the way home from the...
Oh, yeah, I loved that. I think Daly and I spoke at the next one.
Yeah, you did.
We were like super fucking angry.
Yeah.
And like there's so much anger in community and like rightfully so.
Right.
Sex workers are some of the earliest adopters of internet technologies. And like earliest innovators. And as soon as these platforms start like getting funding, we're the first population to be kicked off of them. We are constantly in this environment of adapting to this new online ecosystem within it. We build it and then are kicked off of it. And so like we know how this shit works. We know how losing access to these technologies works. We know what is going to happen when a commission of law enforcement creates a set of guidelines of how to earn 230 protections.
And who that's going to be for, and it's not going to be for us.
No, it's going to be to do away with encryption so that the government can read all of our private conversations. This is an insanely predatory, like, fascist bill that's being signed into law unanimously because of the language that is hiding, like, the actual impact of this law.
Yeah.
All the more
Bill.
shocking.
I'm sorry, it's still a bill.
Yeah. All the more shocking that this is happening in the context of like, over a month now of protests where, people are questioning law enforcement tactics and law enforcement biases. Somehow those protests and this critical lens on law enforcement just isn't even, making it into the conversation in Congress.
Right? And EART IT relies on increased policing. It does nothing to prevent child sexual abuse. It treats child sexual abuse as if it's an inevitability and not something worthy of putting resources towards prevention.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something that I find so upsetting about this bill is that there are already laws that you can use to go after child sexual abuse. You don't need this law. You don't need this bill to become a law. And what survivors actually need are fucking resources.
Exactly.
Right.
And access to resources online. And I think, so that's another scary part of the bill, right? Is when you have a commission creating guidelines for platforms to follow, they are going to be overly enforced, just as they were with FASTA and SESTA.
Right.
And I can't remember the exact language when Craigslist took down their erotic services section because of FASTA.
It wasn't just their erotic service, it was their personals too.
Well, it was their whole personal.
Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
As Craigslist wrote, the law seeks to subject websites to criminal and civil liability when third parties users misuse online personals unlawfully. Any tool or service can be misused, Craigslist said. We can't take such a high risk without jeopardizing all of our other services. So we are regretfully taking Craigslist personals offline. Hopefully we can bring them back someday. That is fucking devastating.
Yeah.
Any tool or service can be misused. This legislation will impact every tool and service that we use online. I know people who fucking hustle on LinkedIn.
Yeah. They won't let me on LinkedIn, but, you
just need to use another email address and IP address.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
I got kicked off. Yeah, all I did was put up. Yeah, they kicked me off for terms of services, and all I did was put up a writing profile and link to articles that I've written.
Are you fucking kidding me?
No, but
you write about sex work.
This happens all the time.
Yeah, but I write about sex work, and so my articles, which were in totally mainstream publications, the next day, I uploaded them, and the next day I go to log in, and they were like, "You've been denied access. You've violated terms of services." Right.
That's happened to me on YouTube. That's happened to me on Imager. That's happened to me on so many different websites. And it's so fucked up, and it's not a unique experience for sex workers. But I think that's such a good example of one way where so sex workers can't work online, but we also can't be people online if we've done sex work.
Right.
And we see that right now when we're organizing, our posts aren't populating because we use the word sex work in them, and that word is shadow banned. Or I know Cecilia Gentili was organizing a fundraiser for Black trans futures, and their hashtag got banned and flagged. And it's that impacts how communities can raise money and take care of each other. It's so fucked up.
Right.
And so something that EART IT does is it is so broad. And when we're thinking about the language behind it of Eliminating Abusive and Rampant Neglect of Internet Technologies Act of 2020, which is a bill to supposedly stop child sexual abuse materials online and provide a litigatory response for survivors of childhood sexual abuse.
Mm-hmm.
But when I think of that, and when I think of how FASTA SESTA was so broadly interpreted by platforms, what we're going to see with EART IT is information about queer and trans sex ed getting flagged and potentially taken offline.
Mm-hmm.
If encryption is gone, queer and trans youth talking to queer and trans elders about transitions and sexuality, which is
so important.
So important, and such a big part of queer history is the ability to have these intergenerational relationships when our families aren't able to have those conversations with us, or we have been kicked out of the homes of our families because we're facing violence there. And so I'm also thinking about the way that like any sex ed material could potentially be wrapped up in this, and any information about like what to do if you've been a victim of childhood sexual abuse.
Right.
People use the internet for research. People use the internet for community. People use the internet and community to escape abusive situations. People use the internet to make money online, to escape abusive
or even just to learn about themselves. And I think that does this like huge disservice. I mean, we're parents of a trans kid who, when he started his transition, watched trans vloggers so much, because adults, much older than him, because he wanted to see like what it looked like on the other side,
right.
And I think that
And I think it's worth pointing out that in the time since FASTA has been passed, whether it's directly a result of FASTA or just the changing climate online more broadly,
all of those vloggers have been demonetized,
right.
And pushed off the
and
platform.
Tumblr shut down, which was another place that teens went for those resources. Not shut down, but it's so restrictive now that those communities have more or less been banned and have left and not found a new home.
And like when we think of these intergeneral relationships, which can provide life-saving resources and community for folks who are like trying to like understand themselves and find like points of reference and information and community are incredibly important harm reduction working tools.
And even just a vision for the future.
And imagining how like a queer trans kid is reaching out to a queer trans blogger who's over 18, and that blogger responds with something supportive, that could be considered grooming.
Right. Exactly.
Right.
That's so fucked up.
And I think that's the fear, and that isn't like a radical fantasy or something. That seems probable, or it seems at the very least, that sites will crack down on those kinds of communications out of fear that, their Section 230 protections could be stripped away if they allow them. And so, what happens is because these laws are vague and because the platforms are afraid, they just preemptively ban or take measures to prevent any kind of conversation that could possibly even in the most outlandish interpretation, be conceived of in that way. And it ends up really, really, chilling, the speech, not just in general, but particularly between, and among marginalized people.
No, that's all horrifying to me, because it's not just about the internet. It's about people's lives and their ability to, their lives and their deaths. And
that's what's missing from this conversation, Jessie, is everyone else is having this conversation about like tech, but like what you're so right. We need to focus this conversation and like how we either live or don't with access to these resources.
Right. Like I'm trying to imagine like the example that we brought up, like what does the queer trans teenager do if they are living in a remote place, if they have no way of understanding themselves? Like if, and what do sex workers do if they have, they've been cut out of conventional employment, or, they're in a domestic violence situation and they need to figure out how to raise money to protect themselves or earn money to protect themselves. Like this is actually what we're talking about. We're not talking about, the internet and being able to play around on the internet. I think a lot of times people, when they're having these conversations, are talking about it as if people are just, I don't know, playing video games online or something, and that it's not a matter of life and death, when like for us and the people that we love and the people in our communities, it is like a matter of life and death.
It is. And there's so many different things that could get wrapped up in this legislation. And I think that we need to, especially like right now in this political moment, like contextualize it in this increasingly conservative push. And like I also think about like queer youth seeking abortion services and like how that speech would be chilled, and actually like we would lose resources on like what to do with an unwanted pregnancy.
Right.
We know what happens when we lose access to those services. It makes our lives more dangerous. It puts us at risk of greater harm, because it's not like people are going to stop having abortions. People aren't going to stop doing sex work. People like are trans and are queer, and like that's not going to stop.
Right.
Like all of this is just information and resources that platforms are being like bullied into removing for fear of litigation.
Right.
And we don't need more litigation. We don't need more policing. Police are not what keep us safe.
Right.
We keep each other safe. Community keeps us safe. Resources keep us safe. And these bills do nothing to actually prevent the harms that they're claiming to.
Right. Now is a good time to hit the pause button and head over to our Patreon at patreon.com/Peepshow Podcast. Even $1 a month shows us that you care and want to see Peepshow continue to thrive. Also, you can help increase our reach with a review on iTunes.
Yeah, and the premise there, and I think this is just so important to highlight, as you said, is that policing is the answer to these social problems, that if we just had expanded police powers, that somehow these social problems would go away. And it's just, again, stunning to me at this moment in history, when there is such a critical lens on the police, that people are still buying into that the Congress is still just chugging along saying, like, yeah, what we need right now is more policing power. That's going to solve our social problems, right? Like, I mean, it's just the most tone-deaf thing.
It's at the core of the public uprisings right now. Like,
right.
We know that this doesn't work. We're actively seeking to dismantle policing. And
right.
I mean, the news, our social media feeds, our conversations.
Yes, us three.
are full of just endless examples of how the police, far from protecting marginalized communities, are actually vectors of like violence and disenfranchisement for marginalized communities. And yet, in spite of all of that, we are saying, like, yes, let's police, these marginalized people even more. That's going to make our society better. And that's what's so, to me, is just so fundamentally fucked up about the situation.
I also want to frame the court itself as an active site of harm for so many survivors. What EART IT does is provides very few survivors with an opportunity, a chance for a civil or legal claim against a platform. And who will that benefit? That will benefit younger white victims who don't have any complicating factors about their trauma or abuse. And no survivor is a perfect victim. And having this huge bill all of the horrible things that will come with this bill, so one or two survivors can be financially compensated by a platform for their trauma, doesn't actually do anything to provide prevention for this happening in the first place, or provide resources to a large percentage of community who do have these experiences.
Yeah.
Right. And all of those, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars that will go into litigating those things. I mean, how much good could that money do for the community of survivors if it was just put into providing services, right?
Yeah.
And we don't talk about
the resources that are now going to be taken down. I'm so scared for the shuttering of harm reduction resources with the EART IT bill, specifically for queer and trans youth. And I also have queer and trans younger family. And I know how integral their access to the internet was in their transition. And they're in a pretty privileged situation. And I genuinely don't know if he would be alive without access to those resources.
Yeah.
And like that is fucking devastating.
And it's so real. And it's the story of so many like queer and trans youth. So yeah, I mean, to me, like I find this like very, very personal and very important, like on a level that's, way beyond just internet freedom, which is how I hear people talk about it.
Yeah. And like as if we're just users.
Right.
Yeah, these are people's lives that hang in the balance, it's devastating.
Yeah. What are your thoughts about what we could be doing right now as a community, or what we should be paying attention to?
Sure. I think that one thing that EART IT does is incorrectly assumes that survivors and sex workers are two different populations. And I think that the harm that does is makes it more difficult for us to create alliances and build power together with community who have overlapping experiences.
Yeah.
And something that I really want to do, and I hope that some of the work of Hacking Hustling can begin to do, is begin to create some spaces for those conversations. I think with the survival industrial complex, what it does is it drives a wedge between these two communities who actually often have a lot of intersecting experiences and actually likely want a lot of the same things, which is safety, which is resources, which is community, which is like care and compassion, and like to be heard, and like to have this violence stop. And I think that we really need to come together from like a point of care and understanding the harm that has been done, the harm that has been exacerbated by anti-porn, anti-sex working nonprofits to create that rift. Because this bill will impact survivors' access to resources. And a lot of survivors trade sex to get out of abusive situations.
Right.
Like these are not two different populations that we're talking about. When we focus on that, I think we lose some of our power. And when people on Twitter are attacking survivors who are speaking out against their abuse, who have found like a home in these anti-porn, anti-trafficking organizations because they're the only ones listening to them.
Yeah.
Right.
I think that as sex working people who may have different experiences of harm or identify as survivors, like I think we really need to do a better job.
Yeah.
I think this is a really complicated conversation that like I'm still trying to find the right language for. And like I am like very open and like welcoming to having these conversations. But I do think that this is one of the things that EART IT does is it drives that wedge between survivors and sex workers, as if a lot of us aren't the same people or have like hold multiple identities. And I don't think that sex workers are unintended like the harm that sex workers will face is an unintended consequence of this bill. It is built in by design. And I don't think that harm will affect just sex workers who aren't survivors of violence.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. No, I hear that. And I think that a lot of times with a lot of organizing, that people who have very similar interest and who may be overlapping, get pitted against one another, and it makes it really difficult to move anywhere and to fight collectively against things that harm everybody within those spaces.
And I think so much healing needs to happen to do that work. And I think it's important work. And I think that like that division is a source of harm that disempowers us from the resources that we deserve.
Yeah, I hear that. it's important to learn about Earn It. It's important to participate in the call-ins. It's important to do a lot of things like organizing around it. But it's also important to heal our communities and the rifts that have created among us in order to do that like powerfully and effectively and to protect ourselves.
Yeah, I definitely think that's a big part of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's like challenging and worthwhile, incredibly worthwhile work. We've been organizing around this since like the end of March for Earn It.
Mm-hmm.
Our first social media power hour was it's like March 27th, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And like, it's just been like then like pandemic, recession, uprising.
Yeah.
And then they're like facilitating pushing this bill forward instead of like providing people with financial resources and like addressing people's concerns about policing.
Right.
They're like, oh, actually, let's increase surveillance over marginalized communities so we can have access to reading all of their conversations and build a backdoor for law enforcement.
Right.
And Attorney General Barr says Earn It doesn't mention encryption. And then like a week ago, the lawful access to encryption bill was dropped. And I'm like, oh, yeah, it doesn't say encryption because that next bill does.
Right.
And like we saw last week, like 8 different bills amending CDA, like Section 230, drop in a fucking week. I'm going insane. Like literally, we're just like organizing nonstop. And like I was on a panel with Kendra and Blake Reed, who dropped like a link to a fake new 230 amendment, and it was like a rickrolling video. They got rickrolled, and it's just like, it's fucking insane. Which is all to say that I think like the things that we can do is like begin to like bridge gaps that have been harmed in community and like have these conversations, these really hard conversations. And I think we can I think of like digital security as a form of harm reduction, as a form of community care. So we have a 3-part digital literacy lunch series that Hacking Hustling has planned on July 15th, 16th, and 17th from 12 p.m. to 1:30 p.m. That's led by the cyber doula and Ingrid Burrington, who is at Life Winning. I highly recommend following them both. They're an amazing source, like a wealth of information. And this is sort of like my dream workshop. I feel like so often that digital security trainings are given with the expectations that the populations will have an understanding of like why they need to do this, or what are they protecting, or how these platforms work, or what is a website, or like what is this financial technology, like what are the processes in which these are happening. And so I'm hoping that this 3-part digital literacy webinar training series will really help to like give sex workers and protesters and anyone who's seeking more information about these technologies that we interface with every day a better understanding of how they work, so that they feel more empowered to take digital security steps. Yeah. Because I think if you don't understand how something works, you may not take the steps to make it more safe.
Right.
And so I think education becomes a really big part of that.
That's great.
And then we also have a legal literacy panel on Tuesday, July 7th at 7 p.m., where we'll be providing updates on Earn It. And it's aimed at accessibility for impacted communities, not lawyers. I sat in last week on Yale ISP's 230 series that was organized by Kate Klonick, and there's a lot of interesting information, but it wasn't until Kendra Sarah, one of our organizers and on our legal team, tweeted like, hey, like this would have been a really great opportunity to have sex workers at the table having these conversations.
Yeah.
And so Kate was like, Kendra, do you want to come on? And Kendra, being an amazing accomplice, was like, I would like to bring one of my colleagues from Hacking Hustling. And so the last series of that panel included Kendra and Lorelei Lee.
Nice.
And they're the only, like, they're just like talking about the humanity behind it. And so I sat through like this 5-day web series of conversations on 230 that were like mostly way over my head because I'm not a lawyer.
Yeah.
And not talking about like the humans.
Yeah.
Right.
Very little talk about that. And it was very inaccessible to a non-legal audience.
Right.
And I think that like as we can, like we're going to see a really hard push for more amendments to CDA 230. And I think it's incredibly important that these conversations aren't just happening with lawyers.
Right.
Like,
yeah, definitely.
Lawyers need to actively be in conversation and collaboration with impacted communities so that we can share our stories rather than them sharing like trauma porn versions of what their clients face.
Right. Yeah.
Like that's not what I want to hear. I want a direct collaboration. And what I think that means is making this information accessible to people who don't have law degrees.
Right.
And so I'm really excited for this panel, our legal literacy panel on July 7th at 7 p.m. And all of this will also, if you're listening to this after those dates have passed, you can check out the Hacking Hustling YouTube video because all of these will be available for free and recorded and archived there. What I hope this legal literacy panel will be a chance for folks to ask questions about EARN IT and feel more empowered with the knowledge and understanding that they have over this bill. And we also have, we have some folks from our legal team, and we have someone coming from Red Canary Song to talk about like what these bills do to communities.
Yeah.
So I think like not just having people with JDs on the panel is something that was really important.
Right.
And I'm sort of hoping that it traces a brief history of how fear is used to create the need for, quote unquote, the need for increased surveillance in marginalized communities, from anti-terrorism law to anti-trafficking laws. I think something that I want to also bring up in this conversation around EARN IT and anti-encryption is that as a community, I think that we should be educating ourselves so we understand where the attacks are coming from. Because all of this is happening in the middle, they're like pushing anti-encryption legislation and increased surveillance in the middle of like public uprisings against the police murders against Black folks. And it's fucking terrifying. And we're trying to, as Hacking Hustling, trying to push out harm reduction working tools as quickly as we can and like keeping up with it. And the other thing that happened in like the last 2 weeks as EARN IT is moving along, and while all this is happening, is Trump fired the head of USA Global Media and appointed Michael Pack. And then Pack then fired like the heads of Radio Asia and Open Tech Foundation. And these are organizations that support like the freedom of press and like digital security tools. And like Open Tech Foundation is the organization who funds Signal and open source digital security privacy technologies. I can link you to some resources on that as well, but I think we really need to be having like a more holistic look. It's not just about this bill. This bill is just one bill of like literally like 8 from last week.
Yeah.
Like, I'm having like, this has been a hard week.
Yeah.
And this is happening while Trump and PAC are appointing like Steve Bannonites to the heads of these organizations and just firing everyone who's doing work that supports free press and open source digital security tools. So what that looks like to me is fascism.
Right. It looks like that to me too.
Yeah. Thank you. And like for confirming that, like when your government is seeking lawful access to encrypted services and is trying to actively unfund encryption and like digital security tools that like people around the world use to stay safe, and like that saves journalists' lives reporting in like totalitarian spaces. Like these are people's lives that we're talking about. These aren't just bills. These aren't just people being fired. These technologies literally save people's lives.
Right.
And specifically like marginalized communities, people's lives. And this is an ecosystem within which all of our rights are being infringed upon, and people aren't fucking talking about it.
Right.
So that's it. That's all I
Yeah.
That's all I wanted to say. Thanks for having me.
No, I that's also important. I mean, it's so overwhelming to me that when you were done, I was like, yeah, I don't know. It's like hard to even process it's hard to process what's happening in our country, with our government, with all of this right now. It's so much.
It's so much. And I want to emphasize the fact that U.S. internet law has global ramifications. Like the impacts of SESTA FASTA were felt across the world as websites were taken down that sex workers use to work and stay safe internationally. This is not just impacting people in the U.S. And EART IT would have the same impact. And OTF funding being threatened by having a Steve Bannon Goonie replaced as the head while firing Libby Liu, who is the former CEO, that is going to have global impact. OTF funds so many life-saving technologies from all around the world that keep protesters, that keep sex workers, that keep journalists, all of these communities that the government sees as a threat. These are technologies that keep them safe.
Yeah.
And keep folks globally safe. And a lot of that is being threatened right now.
Yeah. I mean, and not just threatened, but it's, I think we're rapidly barreling towards a dystopian future where the very resources that, marginalized communities and criminalized communities use to keep themselves safe are soon going to be weaponized against them if encryption is undermined and if these protections are undermined. And that's really, really scary.
It's really scary. It's a scary time. I want to not end on that note because I do think that community is incredibly powerful and that educating ourselves about these things and protecting ourselves is a form of community care. Yeah. Like the more people who use digital security tools, the more people we can keep safe. Yeah. And I think of it like safer sex practices. Right. Like, more people that I have safe sex with, and if they're doing the same things, we reduce harm. The more people that are using Signal and Tor and Proton Mail, the more of us that we can keep safe. Right. So I think what we can do is we can educate ourselves. We can be loud and do our best to be loud in the social media ecosystem that is constantly seeking our erasure. Right. And having conversations about this with other people in our social circles who might not be as directly impacted. And pushing really hard for these conversations to be being had at institutions with resources.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a good place to end. Where can people find information on Hacking Hustling and on the work that you're doing?
Sure. So you can visit us at hackinghustling.org. We have tons of resources. We try and record and archive all of our trainings. We have the legal literacy panel coming up, a 3-part digital literacy lunch training coming up. And you can follow us at Hacking Hustling across social media on Instagram and Twitter. And I would be a very bad whore if I didn't also say that you could book a session with me at mistressblunt.com.
Perfect. Thank you so much for talking to us about all of this.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I look forward to continuing the conversation and to never having to talk about this again because these bills stop happening.
We can all hope for that. Hope for that and work toward that. Yeah.
Yes.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us for yet another episode of the Peepshow Podcast. I'm PJ Sage, and you can find me on Twitter at PeachSage.
And I'm Jessie Sage, and you can find me on Twitter at sapiotextual or at jessiesage.com.
We would like to remind you that we have a Patreon account and would appreciate your support. Please visit patreon.com/PeepshowPodcast. Our music is courtesy of Joe Kennedy. The show was produced by Jessie and PJ Sage.
Signing off. Have a great week.